Good evening. My name is Susan Scott. I am a longtime editor with the New Quarterly and the director of the Wild Writers Mentorship Program. Welcome to our 9th annual Wild Writers Festival, online throughout the month of November from Waterloo, Ontario. Of course, we wish we were hosting you again in person, but online means that we're able to welcome people from across the country, from the States, and really from all over the world. A special thank you to our incredible donors and sponsors that have made the festival possible, as well as our fabulous volunteers that keep everything together, keep us all running behind the scenes. Tonight's session is Birdsong, Finding a New Natural Voice. And it's my pleasure to introduce the two people who will be in conversation with you tonight, Susan Bryant and Julia Zarankin. Susan Bryant lives in Waterloo, Ontario, which is where we are tonight. And she taught at Renison University College for 25 years. She migrated to Canada from the US when she was a teenager to attend the University of Toronto and has happily made Canada her home ever since. For many years, she and her family lived just in a very quaint town north of here called Elmira, where in 1989, a toxic chemical spill, toxic contamination of the local water supply, roused Susan's interest in activism. And she has since then become an iconic activist in the environmental community, especially around water issues, educating, keeping a steady hand, and bird dogging the authorities to make sure that things are done properly. This, as you know, if you're an activist, can be very stressful, which is why when she has some quiet time, she can retire to a quiet space and spy on birds. Julia Zarankin, who is a Toronto-based writer and self-proclaimed bird-splainer, first came to the New Quarterly's attention with her fabulous essay, My Photographs Speak Yiddish, in 2014 for the Edna Stabler Personal Essay Contest. And that piece was an honorable mention in that contest, and she's sort of been on our radar ever since. I had the great pleasure of working with Julia again in 2019 for an anthology of women writers and poets, and her birding piece closes out that anthology. So it's thrilling to be here with her tonight for her first book, and a memoir, no less. Her work appears in all kinds of publications. She's really wide-ranging, so you've probably found her in The Walrus, Cottage Life, Orion, Threepenny Review, Antioch Review, Birding, Maisonneuve, The New Quarterly, and the Globe and Mail. She's also the winner of many prizes and often a runner-up or a finalist in several prize categories, including being twice longlisted for the CBC Nonfiction Prize. And you can find out more about her and on her bios on our website. And now we'll turn the session over to Susan and see you again in an hour. Enjoy.
Thank you, Susan Scott, for that very kind introduction of both of us. I appreciate it. I'm also with Susan. We have two Susans on this little event tonight, and I think that's a wonderful sign. You can't have too many Susans. So I want to add to the description of Julia's bio that she's also a professor of Russian literature and culture. And I first learned of Julia Zarankin when I happened on a CBC radio interview with Michael Enright discussing Anton Chekhov. So Michael Enright apparently had been a student in her Chekhov course in the continuing ed program at the University of Toronto. I understand that he passed, Julia. And in that interview, Julia said that Chekhovian characters are often, quote, running away from something or running towards something, running towards this amorphous notion of what it means to be happy. So in the memoir we're discussing tonight, Field Notes of an Unintentional Birder, running toward and away from happiness, to me, is a strikingly apt description of the Julia that we meet before she discovers birds, red-winged blackbird to start with. I think that the Russian lit connection is pretty interesting, and I will bring it up again to see what Julia has to say about that. But now it's time to talk with Julia rather than talk about her. So welcome, Julia.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, Susan Scott is behind the scenes now, but I just wanted to thank Susan for that wonderful introduction, and also to thank the Wild Writers Literary Festival for having me. This is such a pleasure, and I'm so excited to talk to you, Susan Bryant. This is going to be a lot of fun. So yeah. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, good. Well, I want to start with the big picture, I think, and then get to the important details of birds as you know them.
Sure.
So near the end of your book, you write very eloquently, birds gave me a new life, one I never knew I needed, but exactly the one I wanted. So as I started reading the book, I was keeping a list of the ways that birding and you changed your idea of who you were and what you were capable of, and helped you develop virtues, I would say. But the list got really long and I just quit doing that. So I want to ask you what among your transformations are the most important to you, brought to you by your journey becoming a birder?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Susan. I think the biggest change in my life that happened with birding is before I started birding, I thought I knew what I was looking at, but once I really started birding, I think I realized what it really means to see, what it means to just pay really close attention to detail. And in that sense, birding really changed my life. It cracked my world open. And my book is called Field Notes from an Unintentional Birder, because this is not something I saw coming at all. Like I was born in a family of classical pianists. My family didn't do nature. Nature was for other people, like this kind of dirty thing that my mom used to joke about, like let other people do nature. And we went to the symphony and the opera, and that was sort of the world that I grew up in. So this was a real shock for me as well. But I was kind of going through a career transition, and as I say in my book, I was quote unquote auditioning hobbies. And I came across this essay by Jonathan Franzen where he writes about his bird. The essay is called My Bird Problem. And because I was in such a weird spot in my life, I thought, oh my God, maybe that's going to be the answer to all my problems. Maybe I need a bird problem of my very own. And so when I went out birding for the first time, I had never ever seen a bird beyond a pigeon. Like I thought owls were mythical creatures. And all of a sudden I saw a red-winged blackbird and my world completely cracked open. And I remember staring at that red-winged blackbird and wondering, oh my God, what else have I been missing all this time? And so I think with birding, I really started looking. I started looking closely. I started looking at detail, and that completely transformed the way I live my life as well. And, I'm a writer. So I think birding just taught me to see the world with more empathy, and also to be more attuned to spontaneity. Because the thing about birding is you can have a list of target birds that you want to see, but birds have a mind of their own, and they do fly. So sometimes your best laid plans just don't work out. But what happens often is that the surprise bird that you might get is actually the more beautiful one, or the more stunning one. So you have to be open to that kind of spontaneity. And I think in a way that changed the way I live my life, and it certainly changed the way I approach writing. And birding also changed my relationship with failure. I had been I got a PhD. I was a professor of Russian literature. I was in a pretty sort of high achieving mold, and birding really teaches you to become intimately familiar with failure because even though I've been birding for 10 years, I still really think of myself as a lifelong beginner. And I mean, I make mistakes all the time, and this book chronicles so many of the mistakes that I make. And for me, like coming to terms with failure, becoming sort of intimately familiar with failure was also, I think, a big sort of moment of growth in my own life, and learning to see things from a different perspective. Yeah.
And those that new learning is bringing you happiness.
Absolutely, yes. And I think before I started birding, I used to be a little anxious about the things I didn't know. But with birding, the most extraordinary thing about birding is that even when you talk to seasoned birders, like professional birders, there's still so much they don't know. And that to me is just, it's exciting. And I feel like this is a world in which I will never be bored. So recognizing that failure is part of the process, and yeah, like an exciting part, I think was really, really eye-opening for me.
Thank you. You just said it changed your approach to writing, as well as giving you spontaneity, empathy, comfort with failure, and so on. Can you say something about how it changed your approach to writing?
Yeah, I think before I started birding, I used to really be pretty anxious about a piece I was working on if I didn't know exactly where it was headed. And this sort of made me much more open to possibility. And because I mean, I still outline and I still like to more or less know where I'm going, but I think I've been more open to, letting my characters take me places, or letting my writing flow in maybe a way that I hadn't formally planned out. So I think it really did make me more open to possibility and spontaneity, and also made me recognize just the importance of rewriting, and that you could go back and fix things, and that it will, your story will change. So yeah, and my process, I think my writing process also changed along the way as well.
Well, I'm curious about that process in the writing of this book, because it's a memoir, and it's a series of notes on birds and birding, and those strands are twisted around one another all the way through the book in really interesting, it seems to me, and intricate, sometimes whimsical ways. I'm thinking, so what's the connection between the Horowitz concert and birding at Point Pelee? Those things are put together, and there is this link that's fascinating. I enjoyed that part so much. But I wonder, when you started to write the book, did that balance between the memoir and the bird stories shift, or did things shift as you went along?
So the book actually, before I thought about writing a book, I started writing a blog. So I processed the world through language. And when I started birding, I realized that I was entering this world and the subculture that was so bizarre to me. Yes. And I couldn't, I needed to make sense of it somehow. So I started this really whimsical blog called Birds and Words. And it was mostly about my adventures in misidentification. And, I prided myself on being an expert in avian coiffure. Like that was my only knowledge base I had. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an ornithologist. And I would write these whimsical little pieces every time I went out. And then then, slowly I made some birding friends, and they would all correct my mistakes. So I had a few readers here and there. And then I think what happened was we went to chase a spotted towhee. There was a spotted towhees have absolutely no business being anywhere near Southern Ontario. Like, they belong in California. They're a Western bird. And there was a spotted towhee that ended up in, what's the town right near Orangeville in Glen Williams. So this little tiny hamlet near Brampton. And this was in the dead of winter. It was mid-January, and we went to chase this spotted towhee, and we found it. And afterwards, I was looking up the spotted towhee's geographical range, and I realized how out of place it was. And I wondered for a minute, like, oh, how does it feel for this spotted towhee to suddenly be sitting in the snow? And when I thought about this displacement of the spotted towhee and this strange, unexpected kind of like twists and turns of its fate that made that particular bird land in Southern Ontario, suddenly I thought of myself and my life and the strange years that I had spent at the University of Missouri, where I taught Russian literature for 3 years, and how out of place I felt there. And I started thinking about these larger questions of migration and peregrination, and sort of the story of my family and how we came from the Soviet Union through Vienna to Canada, and like landed in Edmonton in the dead of winter, and how my parents must have felt a little bit like that spotted towhee. And so I did something extremely unscientific, which scientists tell you never to do. Like, you're not supposed to anthropomorphize, right? Birds are birds and people are people. But here I was suddenly seeing myself in these birds. And that moment for me was really pivotal. And I started to notice that my blog posts they were changing in tone a little bit. Like, they weren't just these jokey things. And then a miracle happened. My blog died. It just disappeared off the face of the earth. I don't know, the server broke, or I'm not sure what the correct terminology is, but my blog disappeared. And I really took that as a sign that, okay, I need to take this project more seriously, and I need to think about the ways in which birding intersects with my life and why that is. And that's where all of these sort of like life lessons started coming up for me. I started thinking, well, how am I seeing differently? What is changing in my world? And inevitably that kind of made me think back to my own family history, my own story of migration. And slowly the different strands started melding. So it wasn't just about me seeing birds, but it was also about me kind of coming to terms with my life and where it's taken me and my family history. And so that's kind of how the two intersected. So there's still like so much of the whimsical misidentification in this book, because to this day, I remain a master of misidentification. But there's also, I went quite a bit deeper than that, sort of, looking at my own personal quest for belonging and for finding a home. And in a way, this kind of actually brings us right back to your first question. When you asked about the transformations, one of the big transformations that birding sort of incited in me is I finally, like, for the first time in my life, I started to feel at home somewhere. I'm someone who loves, well, in non-COVID times, I love running around and I love traveling. And I used to think that Toronto was really ugly. I mean, it's still not the most beautiful place in the world, but I used to think that in order to see nature, you had to go really far away. And when I started birding, it opened my eyes to all the green space around me. It opened my eyes just like to the miracle and the wonder of my ordinary surroundings, the things I had taken for granted. So yeah, so all of these strands started coming together, and then I kind of started thinking of this project more as a book. And I remember the moment when I found the beginning to this book. My husband and I were vacationing on one of the Gulf Islands in BC on Denman Island. And I was, we were visiting my grade 5 teacher, and I was reading the island newspaper. And there was an ad on the back of this little island newspaper. There was an ad for like a dozen semi-retired hens were for sale. And I was like, oh, I kind of want to buy those hens. I did not return to Toronto with 12 semi-retired hens. But once again, I did that thing where suddenly I was identifying with the hens. And I thought, okay, well, what is a person who is kind of like a semi-retired hen? Like, I started identifying with that semi-retired hen. What does a person do in midlife who's going through a career transition, who doesn't really know where life is headed? What does that person do? She becomes a mad birder. And that kind of gave me the beginning of my book. And that's where things started from. And the book also relays the story of how I fell in love with my husband and how, we ended up getting married. And so that's another arc to the book. So the book does many things. It's birds, but it's also life. And it's also searching for meaning in midlife. And it's a lot of things. And I think that's how my brain works.
Yes, right. Let's put it all in there.
Exactly. See what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are listening to you who'd like to hear about your particular birds. So anthropomorphize freely.
Okay, so I'm gonna read a couple passages from this book, and I have a lot of favorite birds, but two of them that are pretty high up on that list are the cedar waxwing and the American woodcock. So as I read these passages, you will note that I am not an ornithologist. I am not a scientist, but I am very much a bird lover. And you will also see how birds intersect very, very freely with my own life. I first saw a cedar waxwing, Bombacilla cedrorum, in Luther Marsh, a few hours north of Toronto. It has a black eye mask, almost as if it's wearing a fetching pair of Ray-Bans and a slick cinnamon gravity-defying crest on its head. Its style is not as ostentatious as the northern cardinals, which basically screams, look at me now, but it's still full of grace and even something beyond grace. It wasn't one cedar waxwing that we saw, but a flock that alighted on different branches of the same tree. And I was immediately struck by the bird's effortless yet perfect hairdos. This is a bird that never has to stand in front of the mirror, wondering whether mousse or gel or some sort of pomade would do the trick, and finally abandoning all three overpriced options in favor of a ponytail, or better yet, a hair clip. This is a bird without hair issues. This is a bird I would love to be. A number of years later, when I started volunteering at a bird banding station and began my treacherous journey toward learning how to extract birds from the lightweight mist nets, I held a cedar waxwing in my hand. Not only that, but I managed to extract the bird from the net, which turned out to be easier than I had assumed because it wasn't tangled and it simply slid out. Nervously, I held the waxwing in bander's grip with the head snug between my index and middle fingers and the rest of the bird's body in my cupped hand. I could feel the bird's heartbeat knocking against my shaking hand. I knew waxwings had silky plumage, hence their genus Bombacilla, which derives from the Latin for silkworm, but I gasped at the softness of the bird's feathers. It wasn't just that they were soft, they were miraculously soft, something almost otherworldly, like sensing an unexpected kinship, reaching toward a hand that suddenly felt familiar. And just as I inspected the bird's hairdo up close and marveled at my superhuman feat of actually handling the bird, holding it in my hands without killing it, the cedar waxwing spat up 3 plump red berries, one of which, semi-masticated, stained my khakis. So much for the resplendent beauty of nature. There is absolutely nothing cute or passive or demure about birds. Soft, silky plumage notwithstanding. Should I read another one about the woodcock?
Yes.
Okay, all right. If I could get a bird inked on my body, it would be the American woodcock, the largest North American shorebird, which hangs out mostly on damp ground in the woods, perfectly camouflaged with its surroundings. To me, the bird looks like an accident of nature. Its eyes grotesquely close together, perched high up on its head, giving it almost 360 degrees of vision for detecting predators, and a long, ultra-sensitive bill for probing the ground for worms that it cannot see. Stocky, short-legged, incessantly pouting, this is a bird with attitude. And yet the American woodcock is also one of the more curious Don Juans of the avian world. In early spring at dusk, the bird engages in an aerial mating dance that counts among the more peculiar things I've ever seen. The aerial display of the woodcock is so odd that many birding clubs host outings just to bear witness to the bird's eccentric pre-mating ritual. It begins with a nasal peent, repeated more times than strictly necessary. The ornithologist oracle Frank Chapman calls that peent, quote unquote, the first notes of his love song. And if that nasal note weren't enough to get a girl going, what follows is nothing short of spectacular. This pouty, stocky woodcock hurls himself high into the ether on whistling wings, ascending in a series of wide circles, as if he'd suddenly developed the agility of a nymph. Then he plummets to the ground with a yelp and does the acrobatic feat all over again. These peents and aerial dances work like a charm in the spring. The American woodcock mates morning and night without fail for 8 straight weeks. What female wouldn't be seduced by such a show? After witnessing the stocky bird's transformation into an aerial gymnast, even I could be convinced to mate with a woodcock.
Thank you. So I want to turn back to the Russian connection, and to I think the biggest character other than you in your human character in your book, who's your grandmother. It was interesting to me that you did not meet her in person, only rare long distance raspy phone calls until you were 9. And yet she's been a very special part of your life. She's also one of the people who had no idea what you were doing outside and why you would bother with birding. But there's obviously a close connection there. Would you say something more about her and your relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my grandmother, so my grandmother and my late grandfather and my great grandmother were refuseniks. We emigrated from Russia in the late 70s. They didn't want to leave at that time. And then when they did apply for exit visas in the early 80s, they were denied exit visas. And so the term for these people is refuseniks. They couldn't leave the Soviet Union for 9 years. So over that period of time, my grandmother would send us parcels, and she had very high expectations for me. She hoped that she had loved microbiology as a child. She sent me all these primers about microbiology. I really couldn't care less about microbiology. She sent me all these books from the Soviet Union. So she was this very much, even though I didn't know her until much later, still she was this presence in my life. Like these packages would arrive and I'd be forced to write Russian letters to her, and it was a strange relationship. And so when she finally arrived in we lived in BC at the time, we lived in Vancouver. When she finally arrived in Vancouver, she had hoped that by then I would be a ballerina with perfect posture and acing all my science classes. And I always felt like I was a little bit of a disappointment to her. But then, finally I got a PhD and she was like, oh, at least you're a doctor of something, right? And then when I started birding, she was just like, what happened? You used to be normal. You used to go to the opera, and now you wake up at 4 a.m. and you go to a sewage lagoon. And there's this part in my book where I try to tell her that, well, ornithology is part science also. And she just kind of barked like, it's the wrong kind of science. But so I think, my grandmother's whole life in emigration in Canada was just sort of coming to terms with disappointment. Nothing was quite the way she expected. And also, she emigrated in her late 50s, which meant she was leaving a whole world behind. And there was really nothing for her here because when she arrived, she was too old to work. So there was a tremendous disappointment. And my relationship with her really sort of grew out of that. But as I was going through my own career transitions and sort of the disappointments in my own life, I started to look at her and sort of look at her own life with a great deal more empathy and more understanding for what it means to leave a whole world behind. And the whole birding thing was really odd for my family. They just really didn't get it. This was a whole world that they knew nothing about. And I often asked my grandmother, well, you're from Russia. There's so many great national parks there. And she was like, I was sent to the kolkhoz, to these communal farms. It was basically forced labor that they were supposed to do to pick sugar beets every summer. She was like, trust me, I had enough nature to last a lifetime. So it was fascinating that I was embracing this world that to her had such different connotations, and these sort of connotations of forced labor. And there was, whereas I was seeing beauty in nature and it was opening my eyes to wonder, for her, just the mere mention of nature brought up like all this trauma that she felt from the Soviet Union. So that's always been really, really interesting to me. Now she's very on board with my passion for birds. And, she phones me every time she sees a bird dress somewhere nearby. She's like, you got to go try this on.
There just seems to be such an affection between the two of you, in spite of and with all of that interesting past and trauma and her bafflement. And that's an interesting part of the book to me. And then she's the one who introduces you to your husband. I love that.
Yeah, so she did end up introducing me to my husband, which was a very peculiar turn of events. One of her neighbors was friends with somebody who had an eligible bachelor son, and it just kind of went from there. And you asked me about the transformations that birding brought to my life, and I've joked about this on the CBC that birds did not teach me how to fall in love because I was already pretty good at that. But I think they really taught me how to stay in love, because when you look at a bird, and it's really, really important to look at what's in front of you instead of looking at what you hope would be in front of you. So it's really important to pay close attention to detail and not to want to turn the bird into something more exciting or more rare or whatever. And that to me was a real lesson in how to communicate and how to appreciate a person for who he is rather than who I might want to turn him into.
Well, and he seems so much to appreciate you for who you are.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Yeah, I think anyone who reads the book falls in love with your husband. That's a given. So another pleasure for us. Your self-deprecating humor, you're making fun of yourself all the time about your misidentifications, about your bad hair, about the fact that you can't play the piano as well as you'd like, the fact, you know, that your body doesn't do everything you want it to do in your adult ballet classes, and so on. And that's a very endearing and delicious aspect of the book. But you do this with a very, to me, it sounds like your voice is a very confident and put together voice. So how do you, while you're making fun of yourself, how do you do this? I mean, it's a good trick.
I think it's one of the tricks that comes quite naturally to me. And this sort of brings us back to Russian literature. One of my favorite writers is Anton Chekhov. Both his plays and his stories are absolutely extraordinary. And I think one thing he does, and this is where I feel a great affinity for him, is he's constantly just noticing just ordinary absurdities, and the way in which this world we live in is so fundamentally ridiculous. Like, we try, and you know, we're such achievers, and we want so much. And Chekhov always reminds us that, you know, we know exactly where we're headed. This is all so futile in a way. And so he's always underscoring the fundamental absurdity of life and of wanting all of these things. So I think I've grown up with that. I've internalized that way of seeing, and I love turning it on myself as well. And I think it's really important to be able to laugh at yourself, and because otherwise life is just, it's all very serious and earnest and tragic. And that's kind of how I live my life and how I see the world. And to me, things are interesting when they're a little bit strange. That to me is probably my favorite part of the writing process, when I can articulate the strangeness. And I do a lot of that through humor. But I also think that my use of my, at least what, sorry, let me try to rephrase that. My use of humor is also, it also gets at, like, there, yes, it's funny, but there's also a sadness. Like, I think throughout, you know, even like my engagement with my grandmother, and I think she's hilarious. So there's this underlying loss that she's experienced, this loss of a homeland, this fundamental loss of identity. So I try to balance the two, the ridiculousness with the very serious thing that people are grappling with, or that I'm grappling with. And for me, so much of the journey of writing this book was also trying to figure out, okay, what is my place in midlife? Like, life has not gone according to plan. I thought I had a plan, and everything just kind of went belly up. Like, I quit my job in Missouri. I moved back home to Canada. Things were very, very uncertain. So I was grappling with a lot when I discovered birds. So, like, the self-deprecating humor, it's also balanced by, I think, the more serious stuff that's going on. But I can't write things that are 100% serious, because then I start crying, and then God knows what my readers are doing. So and it just becomes too much. So to me, I really, it's a delicate dance between the two.
That is the Russian, bit of the Russian connection, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's also the thing about Chekhov. He's always laughing through tears.
Yes, it's
right.
It's a kind of melancholic humor.
Definitely. And there's another Russian writer that I respect a great deal, Isaac Babin, and he always says, like, I carry autumn in my heart. And I feel that way a little bit too. I think I can relate to that. It must be, all those years of, like, all those years of migration that my family went through. It's almost like it's inscribed in my genes. Mm-hmm. And I remember it when I was a kid. I used to laugh, or we would, like, tell each other jokes and laugh, and my grandmother would be like, stop laughing. If you you should never laugh because, you know, who knows when the next pogrom is going to happen. And that's like something I grew up with, like,
Yes.
who knows when the next thing is the next disaster. So the two work in tandem for me.
You do. And you make that clear in your book. Well, we have a little bit more time before the Q&A begins, and I'd just like to invite people, if you have questions of Julia, please. I think you put them in the chat or something like that.
In the Q&A, yeah.
In the Q&A box. All right, good. And we will see how many we can get to. Julia, what else would you like to talk about?
What else would I like to talk about? Oh my goodness.
Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, what would you write next? Where are you going to move from here?
So actually, I'm working on a novel, and this is a departure for me. This is something totally new, but I'm very excited about it. It's a novel about a Russian emigre family, three generations of very strong women, and there's unexpectedly there's a lot of adult ballet in there. So that's all I'm going to say because I'm superstitious. But
No,
yeah,
right. You should
I'm working
say
on fiction.
Well, we'll look forward to that for sure. Do you want to say something about bird banding and your experience there? And it's a social experience, too, very much so. And I enjoyed your descriptions of the people that you worked with when you were out on the island in Maine, watching terns and various other shorebirds very closely. The human connection and the collective tribal connection with other banders and with the people that you were living in the living wild.
Living wild, yeah. So, you know, another thread throughout this book is also me trying to find my wild side through birds, right? I grew up completely indoors, and once I discovered nature through birds. Like, you know, as I mentioned, nature isn't something that I did with my family. And as I discovered birds, I was curious about the people who did bird research. So I started volunteering at a bird banding station. And what bird banding really is, it's tracking bird population, tracking bird migration. So there's a bird banding station in downtown Toronto where I volunteer in non-pandemic times. And we trap birds in mist nets and then take them out of the mist net really, really quickly and put a band, like a little ring, a metallic ring on the bird's right foot. And we write down all this, like we weigh it, we sex it, we try to get as much data as possible on the birds, and then we let them go. And the experience of volunteering at the bird banding station here in Toronto, I call it bravery school, like literally, because that's what it was. Not only did I not grow up with nature, but we didn't grow up with pets. Like, you know, I was terrified, I'm still kind of terrified of all living creatures except humans. And here at the banding station, I held a bird for the first time in my hand. And I don't know if you've ever held a songbird, but they are tiny. I mean, they weigh between 5 and 10 or 5 and 15 grams. So we're talking something extremely tiny. And I held that bird in my hand for the first time. And it was such an unbelievable feeling just to hold that bird, and also to hold that responsibility, that fragility in your hand. And it's this really magical moment because, well, birds fly, right? They don't sit still very often, and to have that in your hand, that was a real magical moment for me. And it was also a really trying moment for me because it took me 2 years of volunteering to gain the confidence to touch a bird. For the first 2 years, I mean, I was the scribe, right? When they ban the bird, there's always somebody who writes the data, and that was me. That was how I felt comfortable. And then slowly I developed the confidence to actually handle birds. And from there, I decided that all right, I really have to test my wilderness skills. And I signed up to volunteer on a remote island in Maine, off the coast of Maine, where they were tracking breeding tern populations. And that was the point at which I realized that I don't really have a wild side. So I was there for close to a week and the weather conditions were horrible. And I arrived on this island and I realized I didn't even know how to put up my tent and I had brought all the wrong clothes with me. And that was also a really challenging moment and a real moment of personal reckoning that, okay, I'm not going to be this wilderness field worker. That is a dream that should have happened 20 years ago, not right now. So a lot of the book is about me coming to terms with my own limitations and also about me figuring out, well, what kind of birder am I going to be? Like, because you could be a hyper competitive birder, or you could do bird research, or you could just be a backyard birder. And finally, the compromise that I sort of come to is that sometimes I'm a birder, sometimes I chase birds, sometimes I do that. Sometimes I'm just happy sitting in my parents' garden, watching the birds in the backyard. And mostly I'm an urban birder who really loves seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary. And that's kind of where I landed. I tried to be wild. It didn't work. I really hated the wet tent. I loved meeting the people, but I don't think they really loved meeting me. They were just confused about what I was doing there. But I still volunteer at the bird banding station here in Toronto, and I'm slowly getting better. And just the experience of handling birds and coming that close to the miracle of flight. I mean, it's like nothing else I ever get to experience. So, yeah. So much of this book is just me grappling with who I am, really. And that's where the memoir piece comes in. So
I'm going to have to grab another cord.
Okay, well, while Susan is grabbing another cord, there's some questions in the Q&A, which I am more than happy to answer.
And I can also put them to you if you like. I'll just
Sure.
hop in here. My name's Emily Bednars. I'm the festival manager and also the person who jumps on if someone's computer dies. So, okay, so I'm just going to take a peek in the Q&A here. Yeah, I was kind of curious about this too, actually, Julia. How much of your day now revolves around bird watching now that we're we're hosting this festival online?
Well, I should start by saying that birding has really helped me stay sane during the pandemic. I mean, it's really easy to do in a pandemic because you're outside and you're social distancing by nature. So during spring migration, which is the most exciting season ever, I was out almost every day. It was extraordinary. Now I go out birding 2-3 times a week. I mean, I do work. I do have a life, unfortunately, outside of birds. So, but I try to go out 2 or 3 times, and it does wonders for my mental health. And it's so great. You know what's so great right now? Like, we're all cooped up constantly, and it's so amazing to be out in nature and to realize that the birds don't care about COVID. Actually, it doesn't concern them at all. They are flourishing. And in fact, I think they're flourishing even more because of the decrease in pollution since the pandemic started, and that they're free. They're free to go anywhere. And it's so wonderful to be reminded of that because we've been living such a cooped up life for the past 7 months. So
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you're seeing more birds now, I guess, like out and about? Like, has your experience out there changed in terms of the, I don't know, populations that you've been seeing? Or
well, I mean, interestingly enough, so many people in the spring were saying, oh my God, were birds always this loud? And I think because there was such a decrease in noise pollution, suddenly people were hearing birds a lot more. I don't think birds have gotten louder or anything. I think it's just a decrease in pollution. I'm seeing a lot of birds because I'm out a lot, but oh, you're back, Susan. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had a sudden power issue just to make everything exciting.
No problem. We were just talking about keeping up with bird watching during the pandemic. So
Yeah, but what's really interesting is there is a citizen science website called eBird. It's run through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they keep track of bird sightings. And eBird numbers have been going through the roof ever since the pandemic started. So a lot of people are out. A lot of people are, learning to appreciate nature, learning to look for the first time. And I wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail back in May called "The Pandemic Might Be Turning All of Us into Birders," and that's basically what I was sort of writing about and thinking about at that time. So.
Interesting. Yeah.
all right, are you good to take over now, Susan?
I think so. Do we have some, is it question time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, have some questions?
Oh, this is a good one that I will answer. What exactly did you see in that first bird, the red-winged blackbird, that cracked your world open? So what happened was I was out birding for the first time ever. I didn't even have binoculars, and we had been staring at ducks for about 2.5 hours. It was freezing cold. It was April. We were looking out on Lake Ontario, and everybody was super excited because there was a western grebe. I didn't even know what a mallard was. I mean, the word western grebe really did nothing for me at that time. And we had just been standing there for 2.5 hours. Every single duck looked black to me. At one point, I was just, I started focusing on the CN Tower because that was really the only thing I could identify. And as we were walking back to the parking lot, I started to prepare my exit speech. I'm like, all right, you guys were all super nice. This is a great hobby. I'm out, peace out. I'm out of here. And right when I was about to tell them that, see you guys later, nice to meet you, suddenly I saw a red-winged blackbird. It was perched on a cattail doing its screechy call. And I looked at it, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. Yeah, I'm sure you've all seen a red-winged blackbird, but it's black and it has red and yellow on its epaulets. And I was mesmerized. And I looked at my bird leader, guide person, and I was like, is this a rare bird from Peru? And he just started laughing, and he said, this is the most common spring migrant. What are you talking about? And at that moment, I wondered, like, what else have I been missing? If this is the most common bird, oh my God, there's a whole world out there. And that moment changed my life. I don't think I realized at that moment that it changed my life, because it still took me a year to go back in the field. I wasn't quite ready to become the bird nerd, but I couldn't stop thinking about the red-winged blackbird. And everywhere I went, I would point it out to my husband. I'm like, look, I know a bird. And then finally I went back, and surely enough, the more you see, the more you want to see. And then it slowly turns into obsession. And there's actually a question here. What's the line between hobby and obsession? Well, I mean, I do have a spouse who is a non-birder. When we went to Arizona, one of our bird guides referred to him as an SOB. And my husband was like, what? And he's like, yeah, spouse of a birder. So the spouse of the birder means that I can't get too carried away. And also I have a job and I work. But some days it does feel like an obsession. Like when there's a rare bird, I sometimes run for it, or rather hop in my car and drive hours for it. And then it feels like an obsession. So I think it depends on the day. Mostly it's a hobby, but sometimes I get quite greedy and it turns into an obsession.
Can you see the questions,
I
Julie?
can, yeah. What's on your bird bucket list? Oh my God, so many birds. We went to Costa Rica for the first time, and that was extraordinary. It was my first time in the tropics, and just the colors there, like the turquoise. And we don't have colorful birds like that here. So I definitely want to, in a post-COVID world, I want to go back to Central America, South America, but more feasible bird on my bucket list is the blue grosbeak, which I missed when we were in New Jersey, in Cape May, New Jersey. So I would go to great lengths to see that bird. Yeah, can't wait to see that.
Does that bird come up here?
No, but very rarely. So, sometimes it does, but in the wrong plumage. See, that's another thing about birds. I want to see the male, and I want to see the male in breeding plumage. I'm very greedy and, picky about how I want my birds. And I don't want it to just be a flyover. No, I want the full frontal. So yeah, I would drive at great lengths to see that. The last bird I chased, what was the last bird I chased? I chased a tufted duck recently that made it into the book. That was very, very exciting. So I do chase birds, depending on what it is. I go to pretty, serious lengths to see one.
Yeah.
When writing about your passion, are you mindful or not of disengaging the reader who has more moderate views? What techniques do you use? So I think as you have probably realized from this conversation, this book is about birds, but it's also about so much more than that. So I'm not an ornithologist, I'm not a scientist, but I managed to see how birds sort of interact with my life and also inform it. So I was constantly weaving those two threads together. And yeah, I think hopefully that made a pretty engaging read. So, and one more question, how has your passion for birds informed your passion for writing? Do you see a connection between the discovery of a new bird and the discovery of a new story percolating on the page? Yeah, I think very much so. So the birding has definitely, it continues to inform my writing and my writing practice. And also the thing about birding is it requires so much patience. And I sort of made a joke in the beginning of the book that when I was auditioning hobbies, I was searching for a hobby that would improve my patience, but without having to do yoga and like doing contortionist yoga poses. So I think just the patience angle has also really changed my relationship to writing as well. And that process of discovery, yeah, when I'm writing and I'm getting to know my characters, or even when I write creative nonfiction, like getting to know myself in a different way and bringing myself back to that specific moment. Where it really connects with birding is the ability to focus in on the minute details and to really pay attention to them and to watch them come to life. So I feel like it has really informed my writing in those ways. What hobbies did you audition and discard? Oh my God, so many. I tried book binding, which I still kind of love, but it didn't really stick the way birds did. What else? Paper making, like all these crafts, pottery, yoga, that really didn't work out for me. Yeah, those were some of the ones that didn't stick. Your husband isn't a birder and you're very keen about birds. How do you deal with that difference? That's a good question, and I write about that quite a bit in my book. So, when we travel, he's been really great about going on bird tours, but they're only allowed to be a half day for now. But slowly, I think when you live with a birder, somehow that a little bit of that obsession starts to infect you. Because the other day we were out birding, and he's never said this before, but suddenly he said, maybe I need a pair of binoculars. So I don't know. I might be winning here.
Very good. I think that's all the time we have for questions. I'd like to thank you so much, Julia, for this wonderful interview.
Oh, thank you. This was such a pleasure.
Sure that everyone feels the same, and make sure that you get a chance to read the book, please, all of you. I know that you'll, it's magical. It's different.
Oh, thank you so much.
Julia. So now we're back to Susan.
To the other Susan, Susan from Susan A to Susan B. That was fabulous. Thank you for such a beautiful interview, such a wonderful conversation. It's so amazing when you have a deeply informed reader who's just so attentive to everything, and then a highly quotable interviewee kind of spurts all these wonderful phrases. So just a beautiful time. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to say a couple of words to our audience. So Julia's memoir, yes, is available online. You can order it through Wordsworth Books, and you can check our website to figure out how to order that. Also watch for a blog interview with Julia. We'll do that. She and I'll have a chance to do some of that. And so you'll be able to visit her on the TNQ blog probably in the dead of winter when you're not particularly birding, but you're thinking books and gifts and priming yourself for spring. So that will be a lot of fun. We'll have fun picking up with some of the topics that we talked about today. So this session, like most of the festival events, has been free. And and it's also been recorded, so you can rewatch this anytime during the festival. And if you are so moved to want to support the festival in any way, and you could see our list of donors and sponsors at the beginning, there is a donation button that you can choose on their website. And we are so grateful to the donors and the sponsors and just everyone who steps up to make the festival a reality. Is really fantastic. And we'd like you to watch for the next Wild Writers event, which is tomorrow night, so 7 p.m. It's with the poet Paul Vermeersch, and that is Placing the Perfect Line Break. So we hope to see you then, and you too. I hope to see you around in some capacity. And for the rest of you that we can't see, thank you for being present tonight. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.